Millions of Palestinian lives could be put further at risk after Israel said it will end relations with the main aid provider in Gaza. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency, known as UNRWA, will be banned from operating within Israel and the occupied East Jerusalem. What will this mean for the people of Gaza? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, Palestinians' basic needs of food, healthcare, education and shelter are under threat as Israel cuts ties with the Palestinian refugee agency, UNRWA. The move has been condemned by Israel's closest allies, who worry it could worsen an already fragile humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Israel's ban of UNRWA has sparked international outcry, threatening much-needed aid to millions of Palestinians. Legislation to cut ties with the United Nations aid agency was approved by Israel's parliament last month. UNRWA supports 2 million Palestinians in war-torn Gaza and over 1 million in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israel defends its decision, repeating its allegations that 12 UNRWA staff were directly involved in the October 7 Hamas attacks. Accusations an independent panel found to be unsubstantiated. Israel's move has been condemned by its closest allies, the UK, US and Germany, who fear it could worsen the humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
The entire UN system and other international players rely on UNRWA's logistical networks, UNRWA's staff, to do what is necessary to try to keep the population of Gaza alive. We are the backbone. If you remove the backbone from a body, the body falls apart.
Israel's hostility towards UNRWA is not new. It has long called for the agency to be dismantled, arguing it fosters anti-Israel sentiment, which UNRWA strongly disputes. Since the war on Gaza began, Israel has conducted 464 attacks on the agency's buildings, killing 237 UNRWA staff members. Israel often says Hamas fighters operate from the sites. Despite the war, UNRWA continues to shelter up to 1 million Palestinians and has supported 6 million medical consultations. There's also concerns that Israel's ban of UNRWA is part of a wider Israeli plan to strip Palestinians of their refugee status. With Israel's decision expected to take effect in under 3 months, how will Palestinians survive?
Well, let's meet our guests. Joining me in the studio is Chris Gunness, former chief spokesperson and director of strategic communications for UNRWA. We also have Yousef Alhelou, the Palestinian journalist. In Berlin, Basma El Doukhi, Palestinian PhD scholar in migration studies at the University of Kent. And in London, we have Daniel Levy, president of the US Middle East Project and a former Israeli negotiator. You're all very welcome to this roundtable. Chris, I want to come to you first of all. Just spell out for me what you believe the impact of this decision will be.
I have no doubt, talking to many different agencies on the ground, that what is already a catastrophic situation will become apocalyptic, and that's a word which many of the people I'm speaking to in Gaza are using, and it's born of experience, because if the Israelis follow through on their plan to forcibly displace between 300,000 and 400,000 people from northern Gaza, which, according to the general's plan, as it's called, seems to be unfolding before our very eyes, and UNRWA is not there. There will be nobody there to put shelter over the heads of these people. There will be no one there to give them food, to give them medicine, to give them fresh water. And, you know, the 1.5 and rising million people reliant on UNRWA's food assistance will simply have nothing. And already we're being told that the acute food shortages is going to morph into mass famine and mass starvation, at least by April and probably before. In the longer term, 650,000 children in both Gaza and the West Bank will not receive an education, and that spells disaster. What the last thing the Middle East needs right now is a lost generation open to further radicalization.
And Chris, can I just ask, how upset were you when you heard the decision being announced by the Knesset?
I mean, it's so counterproductive. It's hard not to be deeply, deeply disturbed that so many millions of people, 5.9 million people, not all of them in Gaza and the West Bank, are registered with UNRWA, and the thought of millions of the most disadvantaged people not receiving development and humanitarian assistance is just appalling.
Let's bring in Yousef. Yousef, just talk to me through how vital the work is that UNRWA does.
Well, the ban of UNRWA, the targeting of UNRWA, is actually targeting the future of Palestinians. Now, Israel legitimizes the targeting of any UNRWA building or a school across the Gaza Strip, and this will push the people in Gaza to more into despair, and it will push them to relinquish their rights as refugees. Actually, Israel bullies the world by labeling a UN organization as a terrorist organization. This organization has saved Israeli taxpayers billions of US dollars in the past 56 years. Now Israel has to provide for the social care, schools, hospitals, and so on. And it seems that the world reaction is, oops, we are deeply concerned.
Basra, give me your reaction to what has happened here. UNRWA being banned, everything you're feeling, you know, from your experience. You grew up in a refugee camp, I know.
Yeah, of course, I feel very angry and worried because I do believe, speaking beyond the assistance and the relief work of UNRWA, I do believe it's a systematic target against Palestinians' basic rights, mainly the right of education and the right for to have better future as well, because by denying or banning UNRWA services in Gaza and in the West Bank, actually, I'm really very afraid of the future generations and this generation's accessibility to education and to schooling. And you know, Palestinians really care and value education because we believe we make better future by being educated and investing in education. Second point, it's about actually keeping our right to return. And UNRWA, it's a very unique agency, refugee agency in this way, in this sense, because it's keeping the voices and the narrative and the history of the plight of Palestinians and what happened to Palestinians from 76 years so far. And by banning UNRWA, it's a message of erasing also Palestinians' archive of what happened in 1948 and still happening so far for the 76 years, and actually trying to erase the cause of Palestinian refugees and try to handle this kind of, our refugee cause to other UN agencies and treating us like other UN agencies, which should not be the case because Palestinian cause is very unique and very specific as well. So it's really a systematic target now for me to erase Palestinians, not by also killing or murdering or starvation or all what's happening in Gaza and West Bank. Actually, it's sending a message that we don't want also future generations to be invested in education or in creating better future and even in preventing healing, because education and providing services after ceasefire and after meeting some of the unmet basic needs now, it's a way for us to heal. So it's also preventing our way of healing and recovering. So I'm really very worried, very concerned as a Palestinian who value the right of education and who I see education is a basic lifeline for us, and UNRWA as a provider is important in this sense.
Thanks, Basma. Let's bring in Daniel. Daniel, Israel says and claims, without providing any evidence, that a handful of people working for UNRWA were involved in the October the 7th attacks. However, Israel has had a problem with UNRWA for decades, not for the last 13 months. Is that correct?
The Israeli campaign, as you acknowledge, long predates this decision and long predates the unprecedented destruction of UN facilities, UNRWA facilities being undertaken by Israel. The claim that unfortunately was lapped up in the mainstream Western media of involvement of UNRWA personnel has still not been proven. The UN goes to the lengths of putting together an investigative team, a report headed up by a former French foreign minister, Colonna. That report's in April. It says Israel has not provided the evidence and still goes into detail as to the measures that UNRWA put in place. But what happens is the Western media repeats the falsehood, repeats the unfounded accusation, Most Western states then suspend their funding for UNRWA in the midst of this crisis and humanitarian disaster caused by Israel's war crimes in Gaza. Most of those countries have since reinstated the funding because Israel has conspicuously failed to back this up with evidence, but it's the bigger picture, as you point out. Israel sees in UNRWA the continuation of the legitimate claim, as Basma just shared with us, of Palestinian refugees for their rights, that the Nakba will not be forgotten and will not be drawn a line under until there is justice. And it aligns the ideological, political with the practical humanitarian. In other words, part of this effort is not just to say that the UN agency, which is the kind of guarantor, the vehicle for those rights, needs to be removed from the landscape, but the Palestinians themselves need to be removed from the landscape. That's the position. Displacement, finishing the Nakba. That's why we're seeing Gaza being made uninhabitable. By the way, huge destruction in the West Bank as well. But these attempts to bully or render inoperable UNRWA are not going to mean the end of that struggle for justice for the refugees. But this is a very concerted effort by Israel, and Israel is testing. How much pushback will there be? Sadly, the conclusion thus far is that the pushback is absolutely out of sync with the crime being committed and the need to stop it, and therefore Israel is likely to carry this forward.
Chris, you worked for UNRWA for years. Israel's claim that Hamas have roots and contacts and pressure and can manipulate UNRWA. Just address that for us. I mean, did you see any evidence of this?
I didn't. But can I also say that I think Daniel's nailed it. I think that Israel had a golden opportunity to present to the Kelowna report, the independent report, to the internal UN report, any of its issues. That, you know, there were claims in the Wall Street Journal that 10% of UNRWA staff, that would be 1,300 people, were affiliated with Hamas, that UNRWA had taken part in these attacks. Fine. Give the evidence to either the external or the internal inquiry. They didn't, and one can draw one's own conclusions. But building on something which both Basma and Daniel have said, as well as trying to remove the refugee issue as a final status issue from the peace, the negotiating table, there's something else very interesting going on with this attack on UNRWA. The compound where I used to work in Jerusalem is a huge, huge area of East Jerusalem, Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. It is the last remaining vestige of the international presence on the grounds in East Jerusalem. There's a big OCHA office on Route 1 in Shurfat camp, the only camp in Jerusalem. You've got a couple of schools, you've got some primary healthcare units. But basically, once Israel can get the lease back on this huge UNRWA compound, give it over to settlers for 1,440 housing units, which is what they say they're going to do, magically, you've created a new fact on the ground. Jerusalem is no longer so negotiable for the Palestinians and, of course, for the Arabs, because it's no longer, you know, it's occupied. That bit of the UN presence, the international presence, is taken away. So it's not just an attack on the Palestine refugees as an issue on the peace table. It's also an attack on Jerusalem as an issue, and people are losing sight of that. And I think it's a really important point to make. So it sets back the cause of peace dramatically on those two issues, refugees and Jerusalem. And I hope the Arab world will wake up and realize that one of the third holiest shrines in Islam is now being tampered with in this way by one of the most far-right governments in the history of Israel.
Yousef, just come in on that line about Israel spinning this story to the Western media that UNRWA had Hamas terrorists working for them, Hamas people inside the organisation. I mean, without any evidence, Israel did a very, very good job of spinning that, didn't they?
Well, yeah, propaganda is one of Israel's allocated tools in order to discredit Palestinians and to defame UNRWA. I attended UNRWA schools in late 80s and until mid-90s. I met Chris and many other officials in Gaza. I visited the United Nations headquarters in New York. So the work of UNRWA is appreciated by the vast majority of Palestinians. And by labeling UNRWA as a terrorist organization, this means that Israel is stabbing the United Nations, and why Israel is still member of the UN if the UN is considered as a terrorist organization. So UNRWA is not only a humanitarian entity, it represents the identity of Palestinian refugees who aspire to return back to their grandparents' homes and towns and villages.
Basma, how vital is the work on the ground then? You've already mentioned about education and how important education is for Palestinian people. But right now, food and water, the basics of life, that lifeline will be very quickly switched off.
Actually, I was hearing today one of the head of WFP officer in Jerusalem speaking about the 90% of population in Gaza now, in the northern Gaza and in Gaza and Rafah and in the south are facing starvation. And actually was mentioning that it's 90% of their support services are being channeled and supported by UNRWA. So he was thinking and he was saying that it's really will be serious if UNRWA is banned from Gaza, because we will not be able to access and to support people who are in need. And I am very afraid now with all the level of destruction or killing or genocide that we are seeing in Gaza, but still UNRWA is able to provide and support and the limited capacity which is allowed in Gaza. And I am really very worried that if banning UNRWA, banning staff, banning all these services, actually Palestinians in Gaza and in West Bank, particularly in Gaza, will not only die from missiles and from missiles and bombs, but will be dying also. And actually, they are being killed now by starvation, by the lack of water, by the lack of food. And it's break my heart because we are able to see that and we are able to watch all of this. And actually, the UN agencies, we still have belief in the capacity and of the UN to reject that kind of narrative and that kind of stigmatization and labeling, and to do something actually to push back, because we need to push back. Actually, people in Gaza are still looking, still having some belief, some faith in what UN system can provide for them and for UNRWA. And UNRWA now is a lifeline more than ever in Gaza and in West Bank. And if we ban this, actually it's an order of killing, not by missiles and bombs, but by every kind of mean that it's available to erase Palestinians. And my concern is, what is the message that we are sending for the world, and what is the message that we are sending for the humanitarians and for the humanitarian system and for our children if this is happening now at this time and in Gaza with all this level of killing or murder, destruction. So I am really worried about future generations, our belief. I was a humanitarian practitioner before doing my PhD now, and I'm still working in a humanitarian sector. What kind of message such kind of acts and our inability to push back is sending to millions of people who believe in the importance of the UN agencies and in the importance of what we do. And this is very concerning.
Daniel, do you think the international revulsion at this decision by Israel's Knesset parliament will be so strong that they will have no option but to reverse this decision?
Revulsion is not a policy. Action, consequences, accountability is a policy. And as we've heard, there are several things going on here. Chris shared with us what the attempt just on that physical space in Jerusalem is in terms of continuing the settlement. We've heard what's going on the ground, that this is part of what we know from that general's plan is an intentional use of starvation, of displacement, that this contradicts, this defies, this is in violation of the ICJ ruling of January 26th. One of the main urgent measures called for was the humanitarian aid. It violates the US letter, if anyone pays attention, because the Americans themselves don't seem to the stipulations they set down. It is about trying to remove the refugee issue. That's why when I was a negotiator, we always talked about end of claims, end of conflict, but we didn't actually address what needed to be addressed. That's a real problem. It's part of a narrative. You always use the word terrorist to attach it to Palestinians. UNRWA, terrorists, Palestinians, terrorists. And of course, it's part of a broader Israeli campaign against the United Nations. We saw the Israeli ambassador shred the charter on the podium. We constantly see the Secretary General, persona non grata, the UN called anti-Semitic. You go to the website of any of the major pro-Israel lobby groups, AIPAC, Christians United for Israel, the ADL, which claims it's about anti-Semitism. It really runs cover for Israel and does a terrible job on anti-Semitism. And you will see there.
Daniel, can I just ask, what do
to the UN?
Daniel, when you speak to Israelis, what's their reaction to this?
Well, look, there is, as you know, a community of voices. Of course, there are Palestinian Israelis who oppose this, but in the Jewish Israeli community, as you know, there are a community of voices who have pointed out, written the reports on Israel's apartheid crimes, who oppose this. That, unfortunately, is almost a dissident minority. Others either come back with the standard talking points, or they claim, I didn't know. What do you mean? I'm not seeing that on Israeli media. But if you want Israelis to pay attention, then they have to see that there is a cost and consequence. How can Israel be a member of good standing of the UN acting like this? South Africa was suspended from its UN membership in 1974 for 20 years under apartheid. Where are the trade sanctions? Where is the suspension of arms sales? Revulsion is not good enough. And if you want Israelis to say, hey, wait a minute, why are you doing this? They won't. Initially, they'll say this is a wrong response, maybe you're anti-Semites, but then they'll turn around and say, wait, what's going on? This is impacting my daily life, because right now, outside of the arena of the battlefield balance of forces, Israel sees that its narrative, its criminal actions are backed up in the West, and therefore Israelis don't feel that there is a cost to this, and they don't ask themselves, let alone their government, the hard questions.
Chris, come in, yes, please.
What Daniel says absolutely right. That is true of the global north, where there is no consequence, and that, it's America, those sorts of pressures can be brought. However, as we speak, there is a live debate, particularly among the global south, about, as Daniel said, expelling Israel from the General Assembly under Article 6 of the UN Charter. And if you look at the vote on the ICJ opinion on the occupation, 124 countries voted in favour. And I think what we're now seeing, in the light of this revulsion we've been speaking about, the illegality, the shredding of the UN Charter, and there are a lot of other things. Daniel mentioned the 26th of January ICJ provisional measures. Israel can ignore all that, fine. The price will be they will be kicked out of the UN, they will be marginalised, they will be isolated, and they will become the pariah state that many believe their actions show them to be even today. And that is a price which will be paid, and ultimately, look what happened to South Africa. Of course, they're completely different places, but in the absence of meaningful action from the global north, the global south is taking action, and I applaud them.
Yousef, just come in.
I think Israel is defying the international community. It is defying, and also this is a test for the United States, which is one of the largest donors to this UN agency, to take action, because otherwise people are talking about double standards, hypocrisy. I will never forget the emblem of UNRWA blue and white flags. It will be engraved in our memories for generations to come. And I think Israel is trying to replace UNRWA with different organization, but this is also constitutes the failure of the international community for putting an end to Israel's impunity and violations of international law.
Can I just ask as well, Chris, I've read recently Israeli settlers now have an encampment on the border at northern Gaza.
The festival they celebrated on the 21st of October.
Is this the plan?
I mean, Daniel mentioned the general's plan. Yes, it's very much part of that plan that you get rid and you bring in the settlers. But can I say, the idea that this will work is an absurdity. The idea that in the face of, the revulsion, Israel will ultimately rely on its support in America, where attitudes, particularly among young Jewish communities, are changing. It is unsustainable. And the sooner that Israel comes to its senses and realizes that, the greater the number of Palestinians lives will be saved, and the greater you're going to get a chance that Israel will, as it inevitably must do if it is going to survive, will return to its senses, will return to the civilized community of nations. And that's inevitably going to happen. It's a question of how long it takes.
Final point, just back to Daniel. Daniel, do you think there's any going back on this decision, or is this right-wing Israeli government just going to push on and basically obliterate UNRWA?
I think it's conceivable that the decision is gone back on. The scenario which one should be pushing for is that Israel has to go back on it, because the alternative for Israel, because of the pressure that is genuine pressure, not words, actions that we've just been speaking of. And as Chris says, it can't be led by the US and Israel's allies. It has to be led by the global South. That's where the global majority is. So if there is a serious push, then there is the possibility not just of overturning this, but of actually getting away from the litany of criminality that we see. My fear is what might happen is Netanyahu says, well, what are you going to give me? You know what, maybe I'll suspend implementation for another 3 months if you allow me to do all these other terrible things. That's not the path to go down. It absolutely can be overturned, though, and it requires action. And that's action from states, but also everyone needs to be making their governments uncomfortable if they're not doing more.
Daniel, Basma, Yousef and Chris Gunness, formerly with UNRWA, thank you all so much for your time on this one. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable, TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.